Get ready to check out some books, because today we're going to look at how to start a story and how professional authors pull it off. By the way, my name is Brandon McNulty. I'm the author of Bad Parts, and welcome to my writing channel. I get a lot of requests from subscribers about how to start a novel, what needs to happen on the first page, things like that, and I also get tons of requests to do book-based examples as opposed to my usual video-based examples. So I thought today we'd do something a little different. We're going to talk about opening pages, we'll talk about what they should accomplish, and then we'll look at some specific examples from books, and I'll analyze them, and I'll show you how fantasy authors kick off their books. All right, now let's answer the question, what should opening pages do? And the first thing an opening page should do, it should grab the audience with an emotionally charged opening line. Opening lines are very important, and when I talk about emotionally charged, I'm not saying that it has to be over the top or super dramatic in terms of its emotion. Just give us some emotion that pulls us into the story. It can be something as simple as curiosity, making the reader curious about what will happen next. Second thing an opening page should do, it should draw the reader into the story with well-chosen and balanced details. When I say well-chosen, I'm talking about specific details that bring the story to life. They can be vivid images, surprising actions, they can be humorous descriptions. There's a lot of possibilities here. Now, when I'm talking about balance, I'm saying that you don't want to just info dump everything about the setting right up front and then get to the characters and then get to the plot. Instead, try giving small amounts of everything. Maybe tell us a little bit about the setting, then introduce the character, then give us something about the plot. Find the right balance. Third thing an opening page should do, it should establish characters and world building. We already talked about this a little bit, but it's very important that we get some characters that we can latch onto, that we can understand, that can help draw us into the story world. And you also want to focus on the world building itself. If we just have characters in an empty room, that's no fun. So you have to flesh out the world a little bit as well. Fourth thing an opening page should do, it should hint at future conflict. Whether it's the main conflict or some side conflict, whatever it is, have either your opening line or one of your opening paragraphs signal that there will be conflict in this story. Conflict is the heartbeat of a story, so you need to hint at this right up front. And then the fifth and final thing, and this one's pretty much optional, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. The fifth thing is that an opening page should hint at the story's themes. You don't have to go overboard with this, but if you do have a character who maybe has a lesson to learn, or you have some kind of thematic struggle going on beneath the surface of your story, you may want to bring it up in the opening pages to get the reader used to it. Okay, now let's look at some examples, and these are going to show how different authors approach their opening pages in terms of style and content. I have 4 examples for you today. I will link them in the description below. If you want to go to the Amazon page, you can check out the full sample of them. That way you can see a little more, because I'm going to keep these examples as brief as possible. Now, the first one we're going to talk about today is a book that very few people have heard of. I read it as a kid. I was fortunate to have stumbled upon it, but pretty much the rest of the world missed out on this one. It's a very obscure book. It was written by a British author named J.K. Rowling. It's called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And basically, it's about this boy. He finds out he's a wizard, and then he ends up going to wizard school. And I'm not going to spoil anything else about it. I'd highly recommend it. I really wanted to give it the spotlight today because, again, it's just, one of those books that never really caught on. But here's the first page. I'll read it for you now. As I read it, think about those 5 things we talked about, and once I'm done, we'll analyze it. We'll look at it paragraph by paragraph. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. Alright, now let's break this thing down paragraph by paragraph. First off, the opening line establishes a whimsical tone and it grabs the reader with the words perfectly normal. They create tension by hinting that things will soon be anything but normal. Then the next sentence mentions the strange and mysterious, and the contrast between normal and strange is what gives the opening paragraph its spark. The second paragraph vividly introduces 3 characters, and the humor here signals that we're not supposed to be rooting for any of these clowns. The narrative voice really shines here, and the description of Mrs. Dursley leaps right off the page and into the reader's mind. Then the third paragraph is where things get juicy. There are secrets and fears, and they gotta hope nobody finds out about the Potters. This makes the reader curious about the Potters, but instead of giving us a direct answer about who they are, which would ruin the mystery and the fun, instead of doing that, the story signals that the Potters are the opposite of the Dursleys. And this can be a great way to introduce characters by just signaling the opposite or showing the opposite type of person. Finally, it's worth pointing out that that last sentence hammers home the Dursleys' hostile attitude toward the Potters, while also hinting at the future conflict between the 2 kids. And I'll throw out a few final thoughts here. One thing that needs to be pointed out about this opening page is that it's for a middle grade audience, and it has the right voice for it. The voice is playful and mysterious. It's meant to capture the imagination of either a kid or the inner child of an older reader. I should also point out that although we don't get any fantasy elements in these first 3 paragraphs, we do get strong hints at there being strange and mysterious things going on in the story world. And this page works because of the vivid descriptions of the Dursleys. And finally, I'll point out that there's strong emotion here. The Dursleys love themselves and they hate the Potters. They pretend they're not related, they shudder to think what the neighbors would think if they ever came by, and the Dursleys wouldn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. We know exactly how the Dursleys feel, and this sets them up as early opponents for Harry Potter. The next book for today is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. And as you guys know, I love to promote authors named Brandon on this channel, so I figured we'd take a look at Mistborn. And this is a dystopian fantasy novel set in a world where ash has been falling from the sky for over 1,000 years, ever since this evil ruler took power. And now there's a group of rebels who are trying to overthrow this ruler, and I'll read you the opening page now. Ash fell from the sky. Vin watched the downy flakes drift through the air, leisurely, careless, free. The puffs of soot fell like black snowflakes, descending upon the dark city of Luthadel. They drifted in corners, blowing in the breeze and curling in tiny whirlwinds over the cobblestones. They seemed so uncaring. What would that be like? Vin sat quietly in one of the crew's watch holes, a hidden alcove built into the bricks on the side of the safe house. From within it, a crew member could watch the street for signs of danger. Vin wasn't on duty. The watch hole was simply one of the few places where she could find solitude. And Vin liked solitude. When you're alone, no one can betray you. Reen's words. Her brother had taught her so many things, then had reinforced them by doing what he'd always promised he would, by betraying her himself. It's the only way you'll learn. Anyone will betray you, Vin. Anyone. The ash continued to fall. Sometimes Vin imagined she was like the ash, or the wind, or the mist itself. A thing without thought, capable of simply being, not thinking, caring, or hurting. Then she could be free. She heard a shuffling a short distance away. Then the trapdoor at the back of the small chamber snapped open. Vin, Ulef said, sticking his head into the room. There you are. Cammon's been searching for you for a half hour. That's kind of why I hid in the first place. You should get going, Ulef said. The job's almost ready to begin. Okay, so we'll break this one down a couple paragraphs at a time. First off, we have this opening line that delivers a strong, simple image that conveys atmosphere. It signals a rough past for this world as well as an ominous future. And the line has added impact because it's a 5-word sentence, it's short, and yet it's its own paragraph. Then the second paragraph does a great job of establishing the protagonist and the setting. We see the flakes from Vin's perspective, and it allows us to emotionally connect with her. The flakes are leisurely, careless, and free, and she wishes she could be that way. This creates tension, and it makes us wonder what kind of burden she's dealing with. Then with the next couple paragraphs, first off, we get 2 breezy sentences that tell us so much about this world she's living in. We get a sense of the setting and a mention of Vin's crew. Notice that we don't get any long info dumps or history lessons, just important details that draw us in and keep the narrative moving. Then that third sentence tells us that though Vin has a role within this crew, she's also alone loner. That signals internal conflict. And I love the fourth paragraph because each sentence raises a question, and then the following sentence provides an answer while raising another question. It creates this strong sense of rhythm because you have a setup and then a payoff and then another setup and another payoff. Really gives the story momentum. We learn that Vin likes solitude, and then we wonder, why does she like solitude? And then in the next sentence we find out that because when you're alone, no one can betray you. And then that makes us wonder, well, how does she develop this attitude? Why does she feel that way? And then we get an answer, and then we get another question and another answer, and it creates this strong momentum. Then with the later paragraphs, paragraph 5 hammers home Vin's desire to be free of pain and suffering. It makes us want to understand her situation more. Then in paragraph 6, noise disrupts her thoughts. We transition from internal thoughts to external action, going from Vin's head back into the story world. And then finally, in those last 3 paragraphs, the story gets moving. And it's ready to move because those earlier paragraphs gave us a sense of the story world, and they got us invested in the protagonist. And that last line of dialogue, the job's almost ready to begin, that's a mini cliffhanger of sorts. It makes the reader wonder what the job is while also signaling a sense of urgency. Now, as for my final thoughts, first of all, the style here is simple yet effective. The prose is clean, focused, and it propels the story along. Overall, this opening page measures out nicely. It dances back and forth between setting description and introspection before the action kicks in toward the end. The best part is that there are no lengthy info dumps, and nothing gets dragged out. Some fantasy authors make the mistake of giving us way too much information about the setting right up front, and they don't bother to get us invested in any characters, but we don't have that problem here. Always remember to establish a character and connect that character to your world in order to create emotion. The next book is The Gunslinger by Stephen King. This is the first entry in his Dark Tower series, and this particular book focuses heavily on introducing the story's universe, and we'll see some of that here on the opening page. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. The desert was the apotheosis of all deserts, huge, standing to the sky for what looked like eternity in all directions. It was white and blinding and waterless and without features save for the faint cloudy haze of the mountains, which sketched themselves on the horizon, and the devil grass which brought sweet dreams, nightmares, death. An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way. For once the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crust of alkali had been a highway. Coaches and buckas had followed it. The world had moved on since then. The world had emptied. The gunslinger had been struck by a momentary dizziness, a kind of yawning sensation that made the entire world seem ephemeral, almost a thing that could be looked through. It passed, and like the world upon whose hide he walked, he moved on. He passed the miles stolidly, not hurrying, not loafing. A hide water bag was slung around his middle like a bloated sausage. It was almost full. He had progressed through the Kef over many years and had reached perhaps the 5th level. Had he been a manny holy man, he might not have even been thirsty. He could have watched his own body dehydrate with clinical, detached attention, watering its crevices and dark inner hollows only when his logic told him it must be done. He was not a manny, however, nor a follower of the man Jesus, and considered himself in no way holy. He was just an ordinary pilgrim, in other words, and all he could say with real certainty was that he was thirsty. And even so, he had no particular urge to drink. In a vague way, all this pleased him. It was what the country required. It was a thirsty country, and he had in his long life been nothing if not adaptable. All right, we'll take this one paragraph by paragraph. And the first paragraph is the opening line, and this opening line is an absolute banger. It's a simple image, but it has so much juice to it. It signals the conflict and gives the story instant momentum. And we need that momentum because the next 2 paragraphs are pretty thick by comparison. The second paragraph opens with an atmospheric description of this massive desert. It stands to the sky, it stretches like eternity in every direction. And these broad strokes here paint the overall picture of this world. Then we learn that this is a hostile environment. It'll blind you or it'll kill you with things like dehydration or devil grass. And I love that we don't get an explanation of what devil grass is. This allows us to use our imagination and to contribute our own part to the world building process. Finally, this paragraph's remaining sentences hint at the history of the story world. It had once been a lively, inhabited place. Now it's this empty wasteland. And it always helps if you can make a world feel lived in, and creating a sense of history is a great way to do it. Then that last paragraph opens with the mention of momentary dizziness. This humanizes the gunslinger and builds a connection between the reader and protagonist. Sensory details pull us into the story world and into his mind. In the next few sentences, we get a sense of time passing, as well as some conflict in the form of man versus nature. We learn that the gunslinger is prepared for the desert, and he's made great progress here before. In other words, our protagonist is resourceful, and he's up to the challenge. Audiences tend to like characters who can support themselves in the face of great obstacles, so it helps to include these details in his introduction. Afterwards, we learn that although he is resourceful, he doesn't have any unfair advantages. He's introduced as this guy who's dropped into a brutal setting and he has to do a job. He's not Superman, and just like anyone else, he gets thirsty in the desert. This section is important because in fantasy stories, we want to establish what characters are capable of and also what strengths and weaknesses they have. Finally, these last few sentences speak to his toughness, as well as his ability to rise to any challenge. Roland the Gunslinger is one of Stephen King's most iconic characters, and this paragraph plays a key role in building him up. Now, as for my final thoughts, obviously this opening page is much denser than the first two examples. There's a lot of detail here, first in that paragraph that establishes the desert, then in the paragraph that introduces the gunslinger. And not every writer will be able to pull this off without boring the audience, so be careful if you do open your story with thicker paragraphs. Make sure you deliver sharp details that push the narrative forward. Now, our final book for today is one written by George R.R. Martin. And everybody knows who he is. He's world famous, and it's all because he's the guy who wrote Elden Ring. Now, believe it or not, before George was writing video games, he actually wrote a series of fantasy novels that went under the radar. It was another Harry Potter situation where the author just never got the credit they deserved, and that's why I'm here. I'm here to dig up these hidden gems and share them with you. So we're going to take a look at this book that came out in the 90s. It's called A Game of Thrones, and it's medieval fantasy. There's a lot of gritty power struggles, morally gray characters, stuff like that, and I'll share the opening page with you now. "We should start back," Garrett urged as the woods began to grow dark around them. "The wildlings are dead." "Do the dead frighten you?" Sir Waymar Royce asked with just the hint of a smile. Garrett did not rise to the bait. He was an old man, past 50, and he had seen the lordlings come and go. "Dead is dead," he said. "We have no business with the dead." "Are they dead?" Royce asked softly. "What proof have we?" "Will saw them," Garrett said. "If he says they are dead, that's proof enough for me." Will had known they would drag him into the quarrel sooner or later. He wished it had been later rather than sooner. "My mother told me that dead men sing no songs," he put in. "My wet nurse said the same thing, Will," Royce replied. "Never believe anything you hear at a woman's tit. There are things to be learned even from the dead." His voice echoed, too loud in the twilit forest. "We have a long ride before us," Garrett pointed out. 8 days, maybe 9, and night is falling. Sir Waymar Royce glanced at the sky with disinterest. "It does that every day about this time. Are you unmanned by the dark, Garrett?" Will could see the tightness around Garrett's mouth, the barely suppressed anger in his eyes under the thick black hood of his cloak. Garrett had spent 40 years in the Night's Watch, man and boy, and he was not accustomed to being made light of. Yet it was more than that. Under the wounded pride, Will could sense something else in the older man. You could taste it, a nervous tension that came perilously close to fear. Will shared his unease. He had been 4 years on the wall. The first time he had been sent beyond, all the old stories had come rushing back, and his bowels had turned to water. He had laughed about it afterward. He was a veteran of 100 rangings by now, and the endless dark wilderness that the Southron called the Haunted Forest had no more terrors for him. Until tonight. Something was different tonight. There was an edge to this darkness that made his hackles rise. 9 days they had been riding, north and northwest and then north again, farther and farther from the wall, hard on the track of a band of wildling raiders. Each day had been worse than the day that had come before it. Today was the worst of all. A cold wind was blowing out of the north, and it made the trees rustle like living things. All day Will had felt as though something were watching him, something cold that loved him not. Garrett had felt it too. Will had wanted nothing so much as to ride hellbent for the safety of the wall, but that was not a feeling to share with your commander, especially not a commander like this one. Okay, let's start by taking a look at the opening line, and it's an ominous opening line. The dialogue here suggests that they're far from home, and the next thing we get is that image of the woods turning dark. Then Garrett's next line about the wildlings being dead, that only adds to the grim atmosphere. Next we get conflict in the form of dialogue between Royce and Garrett. Royce attacks through dialogue while Garrett defends. This exchange shows us that Royce is the one in charge. It's a small power struggle in a book that will focus on power struggles. Then we learn that this scene is from Will's point of view. We know this because we get his inner thoughts and wishes. Meanwhile, Royce continues to pressure the other two men. The dialogue establishes the three characters, their situation, and who wants to go where. Then the next two paragraphs provide backstory on Garrett and Will. But these are much more than just info dumps. The backstory contributes tension by highlighting the fact that both men have seen their share of horrors and they don't get scared easily. The fact that they're nervous right now creates tension and raises the stakes. Then the tension continues to build thanks to the opening of the next paragraph. And I love the short, clipped sentences here. Until tonight, something was different tonight. The shift from longer sentences to shorter ones creates a sense of discomfort and alarm. Later, we learn that weather and terrain have been wearing these guys down, and there's that line about how the wind is making the trees rustle like living things. Static, motionless settings are no fun, but you can draw an audience into a story by making the setting active in some way. Another way to bring a setting to life is to show how a character feels about it. We get that here with the mention of Will's fear and paranoia, and the narration reads like something out of a horror story. Finally, that last paragraph shows that there are two opponents here, Royce and the setting. Conflict is coming from both, and in a sense, Royce and the setting are working together to oppose Garrett and Will. As for my final thoughts, the character interaction, specifically the dialogue, draws us into this story. It establishes character, drops some world-building nuggets, and sets the conflict in motion. Once things get rolling, we learn who these guys are and what they're doing out here in the woods. And it's worth noting that there are several world-building details sprinkled throughout. Wildlings, the Night's Watch, the Wall. The story introduces these things, but it doesn't stop to explain them. It allows the reader to be curious and become immersed in the world of Game of Thrones. So I hope this helps. If you want the cheat sheet for today's video, which includes all my analysis, I'll make it available to my Patreon supporters and my YouTube members. Question of the day: what is your favorite opening page from a story? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of any one of my books and be sure to leave reviews on Amazon. Bad Parts is great if you like small town horror. It's about people trading away their sick and injured body parts in order to get healthy again. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, like, share, and subscribe. Hit that thanks button for me, maybe even support me on Patreon. And as always, remember to keep on writing.